Okay, so where to start? I want to respond to a recent blog by Richard Carrier on his blog, Richard Carrier Blogs, which always sounds way too much like Richard Carrier Bags for my liking. But on his blog, Richard Carrier Blogs, he wrote quite a lengthy blog, as he's wont to do in actual fact, how the right and the left nuked atheism plus. I want to respond to that in a two-part response for three reasons. One is because it's about Atheism Plus and the divide that took place and the fact of how that divide has manifested since and why it is maintained, and some of them maybe misunderstandings and misrepresentations that have underpinned that in the intervening period. Two, because it mentions me, and Richard Carrier was kind enough to actually unblock me on Twitter because he had me blocked and let me know, and subsequently we had quite a long and productive discussion on Twitter about part of it. And three, because I'm not just mentioned in it, but I'm sort of investigated in some detail, and I'm way too vain, ladies and gentlemen, to let that one pass. Okay, so let me respond to this. I know a lot of you will know Richard Carrier in different capacities. By the way, some of you may know him as an atheist activist, some of you will know him as a blogger, some of you will know him as maybe one of the most well-known bloggers on Free Thought Blogs back in 2012, at that time when a lot of this really kicked off. And so it's within those contexts. Of course, he's also written books, most famously about the historicity of Jesus, which I believe is somewhat sceptical of. He regards this whole character of Jesus as largely a myth. Something, in fact, which Christy Winters took him to task over. So there you go. She's the universal expert on these things. If she's taking him to task on it, I can only assume that he was wrong on all of that. But what I want to do then in these two videos, this video is largely going to be me giving my opinions, looking at what he's written in this blog and giving my commentary on some of the things that he said, agreeing with some of it, disagreeing with other parts of it, making some concessions and maybe even a little bit of an apology for part of it. But there was one part where Richard criticised me, I think reasonably, but then gave a particular example, and I had some objections to that particular example. And you know what it's like. You know what it's like, folks. How easy is it to read something and agree with 95% of it, and then just pick up and make a big thing about that 5%? And what I didn't want to do was to include that part in this video, which will be very out of step with this because it will be much more evidence. There will be things, lots of things showing up on screen, evidencing the points that I'm trying to make in that part, and it will sit out like a canker on a fruit tree that you'll have to kind of circumnavigate through this video and then get back on to the kind of tack that we're on now. So that will be a separate video, and as I get to that in this, I'll just tell you a little bit more about that second video. Okay, so let me start reading what Richard had to say, and I'll make a few comments along the way. I'm not going to read everything out, it's a long piece. I'm going to pick some pieces out. Though I rarely have time, I occasionally check out what's being produced in atheism, and thus I went on a binge of Noel Plum videos recently. My entryway was researching what happened to the Atheist Conference, which collapsed almost as soon as its planning began, and whose promoters weirdly slagged off MythCon whilst simultaneously claiming to do exactly what MythCon was doing, promoting civil dialogue amongst divided atheists along the socio-political spectrum. Can I just interject at this point to say that my understanding is that Richard Carrier showed some support of MythCon last year and is taking part in MythCon this year as part of a moderated debate with Sargon of Akkad. And indeed, and I assure you I'm not on the payroll of MythCon for advertising their event, despite some of the criticisms that I had of MythCon last year. As an event, I've got to say, right, these are not the kind of things I'm generally interested in, but when I go and have a look at their web page and look at some of the things that are going to be hosted there, actually it sounds quite an interesting event. When I read what some of the topics are going to be and see some of the panels that are involved. How refreshing, how boring are some of these events where they'll have a topic, why people with 3 heads are discriminated against in atheist gatherings on Mars, and it's a panel of 5 people who all are exactly in lockstep with one another. MythCon seem to have taken a different route if you're American, and have picked people who shock horror, who disagree with one another. Wow, that means you're going to get some kind of actual debate. You're going to get some kind of actual discussion. You're going to have people disagreeing with one another live on stage rather than just nodding like a bunch of fucking nodding dogs in the back of a car at what each other has to say. Mind-shattering that anybody would do that. I'm sure there are certain people online who will find that absolutely abhorrent that anybody would even consider doing something like that. But for me, it makes it seem 1,000 times more interesting. Okay, back on with what Richard Carrier had to say. Plum has 2 useful videos on the debacle. And then he lists what those are and then says, I then watched a random sample of his other stuff. Okay, he's a bit shouty. And maybe I should say, which is hard to keep listening to for hours on end on long drives. Probably true. But otherwise, I like a lot of his stuff and his avowed critical approach to things. He sometimes sounds a bit like a social conservative in the European sense, but really he's more a liberal critic of the far left. I agree with him sometimes and I disagree with him other times. But I'm also okay with listening to reasonable people I disagree with, even when they drop the evidence ball really badly. But as I went through cataloguing the difference between his good arguments and bad, I noticed something. A rather consistent thing kept happening. When Plum cites evidence and specific actual examples, he tends to be right, or at least make a worthy point. When he just makes abstract assertions and generalizations and doesn't present any data or real examples, he tends to be wrong. And I realized this explains a lot of things that have happened over the last half-decade of movement atheism. Okay, I agree with Richard Carrier on that on 2 levels. I agree with him with regard to me. I think as a general criticism of me, that's probably right. That when I look back at the things that I've done online, that the things that I'm happiest with are the things that I've evidenced. And maybe I've evidenced them sometimes because I'm happiest with them. I feel the most secure in them. And similarly, when I haven't evidenced them, I'm not always quite as happy with those pieces of work. And maybe not always entirely as convinced in what I've said as I am in those other things. But I also agree with Richard Carrier here that I think that's a very general problem. He's citing me as an example, not just of something that I do, but of a more general thing, and I think that he's probably right. Okay, he then goes on a couple of paragraphs later. A good example in Plum's case is the video, "Want sports gender equality, ? Stop whining and do something." Eye-rollingly ridiculous is Richard Carrier's assessment of that. This is the point where I'm not really going to say any more about that. That will be a second video. He has some criticisms that I didn't cite the evidence in that video, and that video was poor because I didn't cite the evidence, and was wrong because I probably didn't have the evidence to cite. So what I want to do is in some ways to remake that video with the evidence. Let's make right what was wrong, if you like. Because he's right, I should have cited some evidence for that, but I think that some of his criticisms of that were wrong. So I'm going to kind of redo that. What I want to move on to is this next paragraph. After he spends now quite a considerable time picking apart that video, he then says this at the end. So Plum completely hosed this one because he didn't base anything he said on any evidence. He argued against no actual opponent and checked no facts. And in the absence of facts as a corrective, all that came out of his mouth was bias. The same sexist bias most people have, no matter how much they insist they don't. But that doesn't make him a demagogue or a troll. He's not a fraudulent reasoner, nor is he a Nazi or a sexist pig. He's just wrong. Now, you might think that I'm going to take exception to that paragraph, but I actually really like that paragraph. And whilst I might disagree with some of the substance of it, which will be what I'm tackling in the second video, because I don't think I hosed that video, or at least I could have made that video in a non-hosed form, I like the sentiment behind it. What Richard Carrier is saying is that I got that wrong, and by getting that wrong, a whole slew of things can underline why I got that wrong, the biases that could account for why I or anybody else got that wrong. And you could attribute various things to getting that wrong, but really it doesn't require that. And a lot of the time that's a stretch. We are putting our perceptions of people onto them rather than what actually underlines them. We accuse them of being fraudulent reasoners when in actual fact they're just wrong. Contrast that with Plum's treatment of a fallacious argument made by feminist Steve Shives in Peak Tinfoil Hat. Here Plum is criticising not just a specific real-world example of something an actual feminist said, and not some rando either, but an influential voice in movement atheism, which is already looking like we're on track for something actually good for a change, but he focuses on an argument that actually appears disturbingly often in feminist circles. So it's not a straw man, it's not a steel man either, but rather a solid example of something that happens a lot. Not all feminists or even feminists are this uncritical, but enough of them are that Plum has a point to make that's worth hearing. In this video, Plum catches Shives arguing as an example of sexism, something that happened that actually has well-known explanations other than sexism. And Shives did nothing to rule those out before jumping straight to an assumption about cause without evidence for his assumption. Shives is no different than Plum. He's not a fraudulent reasoner, he just screwed this up. He's just wrong. Just like Plum is from time to time, but I expect neither will ever listen to the other because they each think the other is a fraud. So nothing gets learned and nothing gets better. Okay, so I think it's time for a little bit of commentary on this. A little bit of background perhaps, because it's not quite accurate. I certainly don't think Steve Shives is a fraud. The background might illuminate this a little bit. Whilst I may have been at loggerheads with the likes of Richard Carrier and a great many others since 2012, that certainly isn't the case with Steve Shives. And in fact, if you went back, I don't know, timescales get a bit fuzzy, don't they? But let's say if you went back, I would say about 18 months, I was Facebook friends with Steve Shives. Even after he'd fallen out and vilified, in actual fact, a large number of people on YouTube, I was still Facebook friends. I had a private exchange with him, which I won't show because it was a private exchange. And I'm not even sure if I could get to that exchange anymore now because we're not Facebook friends anymore. But in which he asked me if I would make a video or a couple of videos, little mini-series or something with him. And he said that I was one of the few who he still had some respect for, who amongst those with whom he disagreed. Now, here's the thing. What's happened in those intervening 18 months? I haven't changed, right? One of the things, you can set your clock by the things that I say on YouTube by and large, right? It doesn't change. That's one of maybe the more boring things about me, is that you don't get a rabid right-wing version of me 1 year and then trumpeting socialism and progressivism to the extreme the next year. It doesn't happen. I'm very, very kind of consistent with the path that I've taken. I've changed my views on things, but not a lot of changes. So what has happened over the last 18 months? It isn't me. I haven't changed. My opinions haven't changed. Steve Shives was well aware of my opinions and who I am and what I believe and the kind of things that I say 18 months ago. And this was the whole point behind the tinfoil hat thing. And the comments which you'll recall that I made on there where I said about Steve, what's happened, Steve? What has happened to you? And the proposal that I made, that there were things which were going on that maybe he wasn't aware of. And then he had a kind of series of moments of clarity where things, prejudices, bigotries, wrongs that were taking place around him, he became aware of those, right? And that was a good thing, but then somewhere along the line, he's become both hypersensitive to those things and hyper intolerant to anybody who doesn't agree with him in lockstep, which he wasn't before. So Steve has changed. I don't think he's a fraud, and I think it's a terrible shame because he was quite a reasonable and sensible guy. And so that is very much the context of the engagements that I've had with Steve Shives. So I just thought I'd kind of clarify that there. Let's move on with a bit more of what Richard has to say. So critics of feminism can be disastrously wrong. And feminists can be disastrously wrong, and the critics entirely right to point that out. Feminists need to reason better to persuade anyone they're right, so they should be listening to critics precisely so they can up their game. Feminists shouldn't want bad reasoning or backfiring rhetoric in their ranks any more than any other advocacy movement would. If only they'd listen to each other. And I absolutely agree with that, and I think we'd all agree that that doesn't just apply to feminists, that applies to everybody. And unfortunately we seem to have headed away online largely from that, from an environment that was not just healthy because there was a bit more disagreement, but where disagreement was regarded as healthy, to an environment where there is not only less well-intentioned, integrated debate and disagreement. There's disagreement, but it's just people throwing stuff from the other side of the wall, but where that's kind of become a little bit frowned upon. And that pattern plays out the whole way through. Plum does logic way better than Shives. I'm just going to read that again. Plum does logic way better than Shives. Yes, I'm better than Steve Shives. He just doesn't always do evidence better than Shives. Plum often gets things right. Just look at his video on social justice, where evidence isn't important. He's just exploring conceptual space and explaining his values and policy goals, or he's exposing the egregious misrepresentation of Steven Pinker by P.Z. Myers, who was on the parallel with fucking Stormfront on that video, where Plum's evidence is extensive and his conclusion a slam dunk. Or this video on the gender pay gap, where even if you disagree with his conclusions as to policy, as to facts, he makes well-sourced points that certainly get social justice that any social justice advocate needs to take seriously and think about. But often he gets things wrong, and I find the frequency of his getting things wrong corresponds to the frequency with which he fails to bring in specific evidence, which means even a good reasoner with good values can be wrong. And that might even be you. I think that's absolutely fair. Just let me lay it on the line and say that's absolutely fair. And that's the kind of reasonable critique we should expect. After all, I'm a human being who shits and pisses and occasionally pukes up as well, right? None of us are perfect, and none of us are right all the time. I think we have a tendency to lionize people online and in the media in general, and want to see the people that are on our side or that we champion as right all the time and as infallible. And of course that isn't right. None of us are machines, and we all do have these biases and prejudices and preconceptions and ways of looking at things, especially when you get to the kind of age that I am at 46, or the kind of age that Richard Carrier is at, I think, 48 or 49, something along those lines, where you do start to become quite set in your ways. One of the reasons often claimed, of course, why scientists do their most innovative work in their younger years. So I think that's an absolutely fair criticism for him to make there. And then at this point, Richard Carrier starts to move on more to talk about Atheism Plus and what took place there and what has took place since, and particularly his place within all of that, and the way that he feels he was misrepresented both at the time and the way in which those misrepresentations are still taking place to this day, and how hard it is, in fact, to correct those misrepresentations, that effectively they become more law Lore, rather than based on anything that was actually said. And at that point, it becomes hard to correct them. Let me read you what he has to say here. What I actually said years ago about Atheism Plus, for example, does not match what any of my critics said I had said. Just see for yourself. Actually, watch my video, and he links it, on the subject and try to find any objectionable thing in it. Look at my Sobrado interview. An Atheism Plus critic who, shock, actually tried discussing it with me. Even my own repeated efforts to make clear what I said, all ignored. The term was instead hijacked by opponents into something it wasn't until it became useless. Atheism Plus in its original form was falsely attacked as promoting a feminist purist extremism when in fact it wasn't. It was only after that false attack rendered it a useless term that some of its advocates became those very feminist purist extremists, God that's a mouthful, thus destroying the entire enterprise by turning it into what its enemies accused it of being. Okay, so that's all very interesting, and I really ought to comment on that, and I think there's certainly some validity in what Richard Carrier says there. I mean, it's quite a general phenomena, I think, that we can end up creating self-fulfilling prophecies here, that we end up spawning the monster that we originally claimed to be opposing. And I'm sure some of that took place, that the more hardline our stance, that the greater we pilloried and attacked Atheism Plus, the more we winnowed it down. It started shedding off layers of the more reasonable proponents of it would be shed off first, and it in some ways ended up consuming its own, criticising those who were former members, even to the point where somebody like Greta Christina, who I would have regarded as one of the most hardline proponents of it to begin with, ended up being consumed. She wasn't hardline enough for the people who were there right at the death of it on the Atheism Plus forum. I agree with that. I think it's quite a common phenomena, and I think it took place there. What I would say are two other things. Is that one, I don't think it was quite as benign in the beginning as Richard Carrier makes out. I think there is some truth in his position that it was maybe there was some hyperbole in the rhetoric coming from my side, maybe from myself, but I don't think it's quite as benign as Richard Carrier portrays in this blog piece either. And I could highlight some of the blogs, for example, that Greta Christina was making about Atheism Plus at the time, which took a more hardline stance than he's portraying here, right at the inception of it. The other point that I would make out is that he says, why didn't people just ask with me? Why didn't they just reach out to me? And very much I think that is framing a dispute that took place 6 years ago in the online environment we have today. And it's kind of odd. It's a quirk of how things that have gone, that although we have this schism on perhaps socio-political lines, the actual different spheres have become drawn closer together. If you think back to 2012, these different spheres, the blogosphere of written blogs and podcasts, and maybe what the likes of Matt Dillahunty were doing with the Atheist Experience and things like that, and then the whole phenomena of it's easy for me to say, the whole phenomena of atheism on YouTube, and the YouTube atheist was very separate. In fact, this was a big thing, wasn't it? That Free Thought Blogs had actually taken some vloggers, Thunderfoot, Christina Rad, Aaron Ra, and Zinnia Jones, over to Free Thought Blogs. And that was a big thing because these were totally different spheres. And in many ways, we were hardly even aware of each other's existence, very peripheral to one another. And I would also suggest that the YouTube atheists such as myself were very much the whipping boys. We were the ones that were looked down upon, intellectually speaking, from everybody else. I couldn't source you these right, but I heard a couple of times Matt Dillahunty on the Atheist Experience sneering at YouTube atheists, right? And the same thing with PZ Myers, sneering at atheism on YouTube and YouTube atheists, very much looking down intellectually at what was taking place on YouTube. It's kind of ironic now that both of those figures and many others now have their own vlogs and are engaging in exactly the same kind of things that they were sneering at. And not always, the funny thing is, whilst they were sneering, they weren't actually acting particularly highbrow a lot of the time themselves. But there wasn't the presumption of engagement or the mechanisms of engagement. On YouTube, we had mechanisms of engagement with other YouTubers, but we didn't have those links with written blogs. So it would be easy to frame this. Well, why didn't you just engage? We didn't engage. People blocked, actually. That was about as much engagement. People left comments on Free Thought blogs and got vitriolic responses and got told what a bunch of cunts they were, quite frankly. That was about as much engagement as took place there. So in some ways, I think you're framing what happened back in 2012 in the context of the environment that we have today. Okay, Richard Carrier goes on, but not as much as I do. Okay, little joke there. Noel Plum does this in a recent video. PZ Myers, Winters and Logan. Watch where he brings up my original Atheism Plus blog post all the way back in 2012 at timestamp 1534. He shows it and quotes it to make a point about how he claims I had called for an unbridgeable divide between moderate conservative and liberal atheists. But at the crucial point where he says what the sentence he quotes was about, Plum drops his methodology of basing his claims on specific actual facts and just inserts his own words based on no evidence whatsoever. He goes on to say, so Plum uses exact quotes, even shows my words about expelling and denouncing horrible people, and then just adds what isn't there, his own comment. Bear in mind he's talking about what clearly turned out to be the great majority of our... This is me speaking now in my video that he's quoting here. Bear in mind, he, Richard Carrier, talking about what clearly turned out to be the great majority of our community here, including myself, not some fringe group of sociopaths. Okay, end of quote. No, Noel, that wasn't about you or anyone like you. And you'd know that if you'd first stop and ask yourself, wait, who was Richard Carrier talking about there? And your often strong standard of presenting evidence, like exact quotes of me, for example, would have served you well here. So why did you drop the ball at this point? Strange. Okay, this I really need to respond to, I think. So first let me say, I've gone back and looked at that. And I think I probably owe Richard Carrier... I owe Richard Carrier an apology for that. So I misrepresented Richard Carrier there. And I've probably been misrepresenting Richard Carrier on that for 6 years now. I've spoken to Richard Carrier about this, left some comments. I think he's minded in the same way, that he's been leaping to presumptions of what people such as myself believe about certain things, and I've been doing the same thing. This isn't a one-sided thing. And indeed, on that video, if you go back and watch from 1534 onwards, I egg that up quite a lot. I use a picture of scum to represent myself throughout the rest of the video to make the point. But I think we need to throw this into some kind of context as well, of course, because the blog pieces that Richard Carrier was writing back in 2012 were not forged in some kind of vacuum, but they were forged in the hot crucible of Free Thought blogs and his fellow bloggers such as PZ Myers, Stephanie Svan, Greta Christina, Ophelia Benson, Jason Thibault, who I think had a very, very different perception of people such as I, and whether we were the dregs or the evil in our midst, than Richard Carrier did. And the commenters of those blogs very much followed along similar lines and let you know in no uncertain terms. So I am reading Richard Carrier's blogs in the light of the comments and the responses and the vitriol, quite frankly, that I'd received from elsewhere on that platform, and maybe jumping to assumptions, and maybe also at the same time being minded of the kind of approach of PZ Myers, who seemingly blocked anyone and everyone who regularly disagreed with him and dissented from his opinions on his Pharyngula blog. But when asked about that, about the way that he blocks, just highlights, I only block the really deplorable people. It's only the really detestable people. Let me give you some examples. And he famously furnished a hangout that took place in YouTube on YouTube to discuss these things with him. He furnished that with some of the most detestable examples you could imagine of people drawing his face on a turd and describing him as a universal piece of shit all the time and repeatedly doing these kinds of things as if this is the only kind of thing that he was blocking, when effectively he was playing a very disingenuous and devious game there, and hiding a much more generalised blocking policy behind citing the very, very worst examples, as if that was the only kind of person that he was blocking. Now look, some people will listen to what I'm saying here and think that I'm disagreeing with Richard Carrier's point. But actually, I'm not. I'm agreeing with him. I'm saying that this is the food stuff that leads to exactly what Richard Carrier is talking about here, which is when we then start tarring everybody with the same brush. We start making these assumptions about a group of people and assuming that they are all fraudulent reasoners or working from a position of bad faith, when effectively what we're doing is we're attributing something that only applied to one person or a group of people onto somebody to whom it doesn't apply, or into everybody with regards to that group. And obviously that's an unfair and an unwarranted thing to do. But there is maybe one criticism that I can legitimately still level at Richard Carrier here, and I'd be interested in his thoughts and response to this, which is that he didn't make the comments that he made in a vacuum. So when he talks about the dregs, dismissing the dregs from our midst, the evil within the movement and the dark side and all these things, he can stand and quite reasonably say, well, I wasn't referring to people like you, Noel Plum. But it is quite clear, and I could show you post after post after post to show you that this is true, that there are a great many people over at Free Thought Blogs who would regard me as part of the dregs, as part of the evil within, as part of the problem that needs to be purged. Right, and so you are making those statements in that environment. So there will be people who read your blog and think, yeah, I agree with Richard Carrier there. We do need to get rid of these dregs. We need to get rid of this scum. But when they're thinking about that, they're picturing an entirely different group to the group that Richard Carrier is picturing. This is exactly the same issue that we have, is it not, with the whole punch, or one of the issues we have with the punching Nazis phenomenon. Of course, one of the issues that there is the whole point of whether it's legitimate to escalate to violence in the first place. But the other issue, of course, is that we have this sort of prevarication of what constitutes a Nazi. Somebody will say, maybe yes, in my view, somebody who is genuinely a Nazi, by which I mean somebody in a modern context who believes in some kind of ethnic cleansing, let's say, that it's legitimate to punch them. But if you were to even concede that, you have to be aware that there are people like the aforementioned Steve Shives who labels people as Nazis quite more liberally. So anything you make in that context, you have to be crystal clear about the limits of what you mean and not just start throwing these words around, because it will be taken to mean a much greater pool of people. I have no doubt that your statements will have been taken by other people within the environs of Free Thought Blogs to refer to people such as myself, even though I fully accept you did not intend that, and you were not referring to people like me, and you were referring in fact to quite a small, particular kind of person when you made those statements. Okay, so there is one more bit that I want to refer to directly before I wrap this up, but Richard Carrier at this point is at the point where he's starting to tie everything together, and in doing so, I won't quote from it, but I will say that he takes a perspective on P.Z. Myers that I entirely agree with. It's entirely in lockstep with what I've been trying to say, I hope, whether that's been clear, which is this idea that it's kind of, P.Z. Myers has this ridiculous position that atheism is more than just a disbelief in a god or gods. And it seems that Richard Carrier agrees that that's as idiotic as I think it is. But that nevertheless, atheism really isn't enough to associate. It's kind of a nothing thing in some ways, and so it's not a grounds upon which you would associate with other people. And I absolutely agree with that. And in your life, you need to be more than just an atheist. In fact, even if you're a fascist white nationalist, you still need to be more than just an atheist, right? Even if it's quite abhorrent, the other things that you are. That can't define you in and of itself. So I have no problem with people associating on the grounds of things other than the fact that they're an atheist, and having atheist groups that associate on the grounds of other things, such as being humanist. That makes absolute sense to me there. Okay, this is the one paragraph that I wanted to quote. What Richard Carrier started to talk about is this idea, I suppose, of having a bigger tent and drawing people in, and the kinds of the benefits to that, but also the limits to that. Okay, this is what he said. This should allow lots of room for differences and debate. Republicans and Democrats, libertarians and straight-up Marxists should be able to compromise and get along and debate with civility and still work together to better our country, even while disagreeing and never yielding on some things. This is just as true in Congress as much as anywhere else. Hence, all such people should be able to get along at conferences simply by sharing basic human values and thus always enacting a civil engagement. An organisation should help all of them, Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Marxists, whoever, in matters relevant to atheism, such as atheist rights, atheist interests and atheist welfare and community, or whatever their mission. Hallelujah is what I want to say to that. I couldn't agree more with that. Richard Carrier goes on to say some other things in this, and look, there's another couple of sides. I said there's another couple of sides I could go through. If you're in my house and you're using my printer settings that I used, right, there's a couple of sides. What I'm saying is there's a fair bit more that he says after that. Well worth reading. I could be churlish and I could pick and say, I don't quite agree with that, or I agree with the thrust of that, but I think this bit's wrong. But I don't want to do that because I'm interested in the general thrust of this, and I agree with the general thrust of that. And that's what's important in this, is the general thrust of this. And the general thrust, absolutely, is that we really ought to be able to put aside the fact that we don't agree on everything and think, well, actually, we're engaging. This convention is about these issues, right? So let's stick with that. And actually, let's see the benefits of engaging with people we disagree with on other issues. We maybe don't like in some cases, because we can focus on these issues, because actually that makes those issues more likely to be solved because we're drawing from a wider political pool. I don't understand why some people can't see that. What I will say is that of the engagements that I've had over the years, one of the biggest frustrations is that people have been unable, seemingly universally. I've never managed a single conversation where one of my interlocutors hasn't thrown back at me a conflation between people's views and opinions and how they act at a conference, right? So seemingly, if you have some kind of prejudice or reservations about a certain group of people, then inevitably, if you're allowed to attend at a conference, you're going to be accosting these people and telling them, what you think about them, which is absolutely ludicrous. If that was the case, you wouldn't be able to invite Steve Shives to any event, would you? Because Steve Shives, any event you're going to have that involves anything other than simply clones of Steve Shives, there are going to be people there that he regards with absolute abhorrence, because we know, even people like Sean Head and Ahmed Skeptic, he is described as some of the most abhorrent people on the entire internet, right? It's just absurd, the rhetoric that he uses and how narrow his focus of what's acceptable is. So if you have a Steve Shives at these conferences, then what do you think he's going to do? Do you think, well, we can't have Steve Shives because he's going to start accosting people. He's going to be going up to these people and telling them what wankers he thinks they are and acting in an intolerable manner. Of course we don't. We know what would happen. Steve Shives would attend the event. He'd recognise people that he doesn't like, but he'd keep his thoughts to himself, because that is our expectation. That is the way the world works. That's the way when we go to work, it works, doesn't it? Our employer accepts that we may have opinions that clash with the ethos of the workplace, but expects us to set those to one side and not start accosting everybody we disagree with politically, or because we don't like some aspect of their lifestyle, and giving them a dressing down every time we see them in the corridor. So why is there this expectation at atheist conferences, at skeptic conferences, at humanist conferences, etc., etc.? Humanism's a little bit different, actually. But at skeptic events or atheist events, that just because somebody might have an issue with somebody else, that they're therefore going to run up to them and start accosting them. That we can't differentiate between a code of conduct and behaviour that's acceptable with a policy, and entirely disenfranchising people from the entire event on the grounds that their personal opinions are not in lockstep with that code of conduct and the general ethos of perhaps the group that's in the majority there. Okay, what I would say is this blog that Richard Carrier wrote, I found very interesting, and it's well worth the read in its entirety. I've read some chunks out, but the chunks are choice cuts, really. They're the bits that applied to me and the bits that I wanted to comment on. There is a lot more besides, some of which I'm sure most of you will agree with, some bits of which you may take issue with. There are bits that I took issue with as well. So go and have a look at that. That's all that I wanted to say in this video, which was a general commentary on it. We'll be making a second video which will deal with this, the comment that he'd made about my ludicrous video on women in sport. So I'll see you for that second video. Thank you for watching this video, and bye.